I think in everybody's job, not just in visual effects, not every day is like a daydream and super good. There's going to be fun times, not super fun times. There's going to be times where you feel like a rock star and can do anything. There's going to be times where you're stuck with a shot that's just so challenging. And at the end of the day, I'm interviewing a person for how they're going to thrive under pressure on those bad days. And if you have somebody who's gone to the film school, got a computer science degree, they know how to answer the questions on the test because it's what they learned the last week, sure, that's okay. But if you're talking to somebody who's like, I've had this problem in the past, like I couldn't get through it, I can elaborate like the 5 steps I went through to get to the end of it and like talk through my process, like you can very quickly start to unpack like, okay, this person can figure out their issues.
You are listening to the 21 Artist Show, a podcast that inspires creatives to make meaningful content to pursue their passions. I'm talking with creators, artists, and engineers about their careers, lessons they have learned, and how to make an impact. I'm your host, Alexander Richter. I'm a technical director and coach in visual effects, animation, and games. For more content, go to 21artistshow.com. Enjoy the show. Ben, I'm happy to have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Can you give us a little bit of who you are and what you do currently?
Sure. Currently, I am the compositing department supervisor at Image Engine, and you can think of that like a head of department type role.
And how did you become that? Was that always something that you wanted to pursue?
No, it wasn't, funnily enough. I got into the industry because I wanted to comp cool shots and naturally found my way moving into like a lead role, a supervisor role, and then there was definitely a need for this role at Image Engine, so it was created and I moved into it.
One of the things that I'm always curious about is how people went into specific roles. So what was the element that really kind of pushed you over the edge to kind of pursue this career and also made it possible actually for you?
Well, I think it came from a point of not having a challenge in comping shots anymore. And I don't mean that to say that I can do absolutely anything and everything, but generally, like, I really enjoyed doing smaller shots where I could bang through 10 in a day. I really enjoyed tackling the challenges of combining like 50 or 100 different renders into one shot and making it look pretty. But after doing that so many times, I just started to feel a little bit stale and wanted a different challenge or a new challenge. So naturally, like a leadership route is what looked appealing to me as like something that was connected to the work that I'd done for my entire career up to that point. But it also provided a new opportunity to gain like leadership and management skills, which spoke to me I didn't know why, it just seemed like the right thing for me to pursue at that time.
It's also a little bit what we talked before about the growth and being a little bit more seasoned of having this elements of every few years finding new challenges and also having this industry that allows you to kind of change, I think you mentioned that before, where some people are so focused on this one role that they're doing, one department that they're serving, that they sometimes miss this flexibility of learning from other department and using that in your own kind of work. Like basically, if you are a good animator, you still understand rigging. It really helps you. A good rigger understand modeling. Of course, that's the obvious one. But sometimes just being able to kind of include other roles or maybe even shift your focus on a different role, I think is something that, I always encourage people to do, because I think through time we get bored by things. It's not the challenge anymore, basically. If you figure out, I think always like Al McKay has a great way of saying is like, like what if someone can press this button faster or harder than you? It's maybe, but that's not very interesting. Like learning how to press all the buttons and it's just reflex at the end of the day. It can be challenging for a while, but when you get to this point where you basically, it's second nature to do the specific effects or the specific work, it's always something I always try to pursue. And like, okay, is there an angle to that or something else I can do where I feel like challenge myself and I can open up my own like perspective and challenge? How did you approach to basically educate yourself into these roles?
That's a really good question. And I found it was best to like model the people that I thought did a good job in the past. So for a direct comparison, who are the leads that I've worked with in the past who I really enjoyed working with? And subsequently, who are the leads in the past that I didn't enjoy working with? And I go through that mental exercise in every role. When I jumped into a comp suit position and now like a HOD position, it was the same thing, and you can very quickly make a map of the qualities that you like that you think are helpful to the team and the qualities that really hindered your progress or didn't make you feel good. And yeah, naturally people like working with good people, and that's like the number one characteristic that I picked up, and everything else is secondary.
I think the same you can also apply in terms of the skill base. When you pick the people that like do great work from which you feel like, oh, this is great, and not just from the skill in terms of how they do their compositing, but also the principles that come along with that. For example, in compositing, it can be something like, yeah, you have to have a clean scene. Everything should be clear, structured, even though that per se has nothing to do with the end result. It's just a kind of a workflow thing. It's kind of a team project thing. But a lot of that, like greatness and inspiration from other people comes, I noticed, like from their philosophies actually. And then just following that and finding the right like content at the same time, I think is always for me really interesting. But I never saw that as much as you just mentioned, to really look at basically past experience and then pick people and say like, oh yeah, I want to first, like, for the first approach, like mimic someone's way. And how does it evolve from that? Like how do you do that? Like if you say like, oh, you want to become, let's say you would change departments. Let's say you would like to become a lighting artist in the future, which is similar to compositing still. But how would you approach with your direction doing that?
Yeah, that's again a good question. And it's pretty tricky because there's obviously so much nuance to it. But I would think about, as a compositor, I work with ladders every day. And there's been people that I really love working with and still do work with, and some other people who I found quite difficult to work with. So I would think about those experiences in terms of, as a compositor, if I'm asking for an additional AOV that I need to complete my shot, how receptive were they to this request? Did they ask questions about why do you need this, from an inquisitive point of view, thinking of like, are they asking for this to solve this problem, or is there something more that I can give them to help them out? And I guess that's only the first step, is just like really trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to think of like, how are they so good at what they do? And like, you're never going to be that person. So it's always going to be that first step. And I guess the second thing for me is always looking outside of our visual effects bubble. Because we were talking a little bit before about, it's easy to have our blinders on and just kind of have a narrow focus on the 10 buttons that we press to do the job. But there's so many other industries where people sit in front of a computer and do all their work in front of a computer. And sure, it's going to be a different job to visual effects, but some of those principles can still apply. So, for example, I'm interested in following like web designers and motion designers and like, to some extent, marketers as well, just to kind of see how they approach their day. And it doesn't directly translate into Nuke or Maya or Houdini, but thinking about some of their first principles and where they're coming from can sometimes be translated into visual effects. So that would be step one, would be really try and model the lighters that I've enjoyed working with and try and do what they do. Would definitely have a conversation with them in terms of like, hey, what are the top 3 or 4 things I need to know to be successful? And then I would try and broaden my horizon to see if I could gain any new knowledge from other industries or other people for what might be successful for me in a new role.
That's also a little bit the background of something like this podcast. I think like the best way to describe it is, being a fly on the wall on a professional discussion is actually the best way to learn. It's like most people don't have the situation of asking the supervisor of Interstellar, Eugenie von Tutzelmann, who I had on this podcast, how she did it and why she shifted her career from doing kind of visual effects to multimedia rides, roller coasters, visual rides, and so on, which is completely different. But how she managed to do it, and also like the courage and the like passion to like go this direction after like years and years of a career that is evolving and has a specific direction. And I think that is also the best way that you can approach is actually, if you are working with great people, then just ask them. You don't need a podcast or a masterclass or whatever. Yeah, that's helpful additionally, but I think the best source is actually, if you have these people, just go to them, use that opportunity. But of course, most people sadly don't have that, and I think that is the approach I always like to do, is like create a conversation where we can basically share our insights as if someone would approach us and say, hey, how do I become a visual artist, visual effects artist, compositor? What should I learn? What is good leadership? And so on. I think that is always like a big element of that. So I think that is actually the best way. And that's why it's so important. And I had this with a few people talked about who also do education, with Victor Perez, Hugo Guerra. It's so important to look out who is teaching. As you said, you put people into perspective, put them, you try to see outside of their facade of like, oh, he's a supervisor in ILM or whatever. You're like, okay, I was working with this person, so I can judge how productive, how kind of responsive, interactive, nice, whatever they are. And that's how I judge the quality of their work, the quality of team-based elements, and so on. So I think that is a really, really important part. And I think that is also something that needs to be translated into the digital internet education world, where you cannot just like, someone sells a course for $20 promising you the world, or someone does coachings or whatever, and from YouTube to something. And then you're like, oh yeah, the title is good. The blah, blah, blah introduction where they say like, oh, just do this 5 tricks and then you will work for ILM in 5 days or whatever, something like that. Get rich quick schemes basically in visual effects and education is exactly that you can avoid a little bit by looking at people's qualifications and giving a little bit of this first impression of like, okay, I watched a few videos or I watched a few of this person's content. Do I get their philosophy, or do I get that they have one? Or is it just kind of like, just create 10-minute videos to sell the masterclass or to sell something, just basically create noise to sell something? Or same thing also in work, a lot of people, or there's definitely a bunch of people who are better in creating noise. They're better in defending their position than actually doing their job, actually. I know definitely a few people that main focus is actually more of preserving what they have than actually doing their job, so they basically do their internal fighting or whatever they do. So I think that is actually a very important thing that we talked before, but I never thought it that extreme as you basically approached it.
Everyone has a webcam and a microphone and can switch it on and record whatever and charge $2 for it with it, like promising the world. But what a lot of people don't see is how much work it is to create good content. Like doing research beforehand, like writing a nice script, really like professionally editing and polishing their videos, whether it's a podcast or selling a course or something. And the things that I've personally found successful, or the people that I really admire who are doing this for not just in visual effects, but out there, is they're not saying like, take this 4-hour course and you'll know everything and do everything. It's very much like you want to learn this one very specific thing, like a topic within a topic within a topic. Let's narrow down on that and learn that. And those are the things that you usually get a lot more out of.
That's true. I think that is super important to one of the things, and it became a modern problem, is this: why do you do that? What is the thing that drives you? Because it's so easy to get lost in the information age of like, oh, just watch a bunch of tutorials and apply for jobs. But why? Like, besides the superficial, I want to work on Star Wars, I want to work at Pixar, which doesn't mean anything. And I think the best example, because it's so easy to relate and some people even saw it live, is a lot of people would love to make a game. And I had the situations in university where you can see how the difference between people who want to make a game and people who understand how to make a game, and one is kind of a dreamish thing, and they end up like literally, and that's what happened actually. They end up agonizing about the font of the title of the non-existing game, where the other people are kind of creating the very basic. There's nothing to show basically for the first few months. It's just some background processes or whatever. And I think that is the same problem, I think, in our industry more and more, in every basically media, music, and so on industry, where you lose the focus of why you're doing it, and you end up, and that's the big problem that I see, not doing it by yourself. You're kind of so focused on pursuing a position or a job or like an environment that you actually not really sitting down and just doing things and learning basically on the side. You are already making games, even if they're not good. And on the side, you're like, oh, I want to work at Rockstar or, the next Last of Us or whatever. But you're already doing that. And this is something you were just kind of pivoting into. And nowadays, I feel it's more the opposite direction. It's like, oh, I want to work for Rockstar. How do I get there? Oh, I have to learn maybe programming, maybe art, maybe this. And then it's like more of like reverse engineering to some degree. And of course, at the end of the day, it's still this kind of weird thing of, okay, I want to learn Japanese because I want to live in Japan, but it's hard.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work by just doing Duolingo for 6 months. I know that because I tried that for French, for example. You feel like you did something, and Duolingo will tell you that you make progress. But when you actually go out and like try to do anything with that knowledge, it's basically useless. It's such a small, it's basically like a big cheese. You have these pieces, but they don't make sense at all. And I think that is the biggest problem I feel at the moment, is this missing element of, I'm already doing that to a smaller degree and I would like to do it bigger and more interesting. So that's why I'm learning all that stuff, instead of like, oh, I'm doing nothing, but I would love to work on the next Pixar movie or something like that. And I think that this disconnect is such hard to bridge at the end.
Yeah, I feel like there's a couple of reasons why this could be the way. Partly, as a student at school, I wasn't a great student because I knew I wanted to get into visual effects at a really early age, and it was interesting to like analyze myself and my own thought patterns as a teenager, where as soon as you sit me in a classroom and I have to write an essay, it's going to be garbage. As soon as you sit me down in front of a computer at 2 a.m., sleep deprived, in front of like After Effects or whatever, and a tutorial, I'm really into it. And I think there's like partly from a lot of the schooling systems, and I know I'm generalizing saying this, but a lot of the schooling systems around the world kind of force you to just memorize stuff. And only a few teachers are really good at finding that inherent desire in people and like helping them unlock that curiosity and follow the curiosity, because it's a key component on how you learn and how you be effective, I feel. And similarly, with everybody having a phone in their pocket, it's so easy to become so distracted. I'm not immune to this, but we all used to have a much longer attention span, where now it's shorter and shorter and shorter. And I think the common thread in goal setting is you got to dream big and like figure out what you want to do and then like walk backwards to get there, which is good advice if you don't know where to start. But I think that's good advice for cooking dinner. It's like, I want to make this lasagna. Like, I know I need these ingredients. I got to walk backwards, and in a day I'll get to this end result. But when your goals are dependent on other people making decisions, like getting a job at Rockstar or ILM or wherever you might want to go or whatever you might want to do, it's not that productive to put your life in somebody else's hands. I think it's better to set a direction rather than set a goal. So if you want to work for ILM, great. That's a good thing to shoot towards. But you can start to unpack that a little bit rather than walking back and saying like, okay, I need to be at this level of experience. I need this education. It's better to think of, okay, what types of qualities do the people have who work at this company? What's within my control where I can learn those skills before I can apply it? And like, at what point am I ready? And a lot of people get stuck in the to-do list phase because it does feel productive. It does feel like you're moving forward when in reality, you're just spinning your wheels. And the only way to know is just to do it and learn from it. So you could start doing something, you could apply to your dream job and get rejected. And hopefully you come out the other side understanding why, or understanding like which areas you need to build on.
There is an element that you kind of hit on, is like satisfaction is became a big thing, pleasure, whatever that means. I just recently kind of used the term self-improvement porn and education porn, because that's what it became to be more and more. It's this typical situation where people have 50 courses on Udemy, maybe even on the same topic, on Python or whatever, and I can probably statistically they didn't watch most of them, or definitely not to the completion, and it became more of a, as you said, like a to-do list, like you checked off. It's basically, I bought the course, I did it. It has nothing to do with your knowledge, but because you paid money for it. And maybe there's some psychological kind of like, the moment you buy the course, you will be successful, advertising coming with it. You are like, okay, I bought this course. Now I probably have this knowledge kind of, and that's not how things work. And that's what I mean, basically, is there is not this, it could be from distraction. It could be also the too many options. It's actually the paralysis of, having too many options, having Google and YouTube and whatever. And at the same time, the degrading quality. Because as you said, everyone can record a YouTube video. Everyone can sell a masterclass. You just have to sometimes not even have a name. Even then, doesn't mean, you can be an intern at ILM for a month, and then you say like, oh, I worked at ILM, I will teach you how to become a whatever, compositor, technical director, or whatever. So there is this back to the credibility on one side, of course, of education. But I think there's this important thing of, as you said, I think it's well done. Have a huge goal. That's totally fine. I want to work at Pixar, for example. I want to become that, or I want to create my own movie, or whatever it is, like a Marvel movie, for example. I think that's a good goal in general. I think what comes back to, as you said, is understanding why you have this goal. What is the thing that you have? Because, for example, I had this goal of working for Pixar, and I knew from the beginning why. I want to work for Pixar because I believe it's the best environment, like open people, intelligent people, great communication, interesting tasks, and so on, all these elements. But if I know that, I can basically adjust to other directions, as you said, I can say like, oh, I can choose between these two companies, which one is closer to what I want from Pixar, maybe. So I will go that direction. And maybe I find something exactly what I wanted in somewhere smaller, 10 years earlier, So there is this thing of having this big goal, understanding the big goal, but at the same time, choosing directions that you approach that has not that only touches the goal, but they're not your day-to-day motivation. They're not touched by this grand, I have to become a world-class, Houdini effects user or whatever. It's more about the day-to-day. Okay, I would like to learn how to work in Houdini, how to make effects in Houdini. I would like to learn how to make Python in 3ds Max, how to use that and help myself create a few automations. I think that is the way that should be approached. And personally, I approach everything into what do I need? So I actually do everything that I do is always combined with need, like necessity. Like, oh, for example, for this podcast, I learned more about audio. I learned more about, I'm just experimenting more with 4K formatting there and so on. And that's something I was not aware to that degree, but I was kind of like interested. And then it became an obsession where you think about color grading and stuff like that. And the same thing you can do in compositing, or a lot of people suddenly come to me as like, oh, I decided a few weeks ago I want to learn Python because I noticed how much, like, it will help my flow, my career, or something. So they kind of try to figure out a mental way of like, hey, this is not my thing, or this is not, the way I fought for years and years as an artist. How can I find the balance between learning something from a different field, different mentality, and like way of thinking, and still, not losing myself in this, because it's so easy to learn something like Python and say like, oh, I'm not a programmer. This is not like very easily, like, after like a few hours of watching that, it's like, oh, I don't get it. This kind of directions with mixed with a goal, I think is a good way to, wiggle your way through that.
So you touched on it before in saying that there are some people who just want to learn new skills because they think it's going to be the key thing that's going to get them the job, or the thing that's going to get them a promotion or more money or whatever. But the people who are really successful have that need or that desire. So, for example, I learned Python because there was buttons I was pressing 10 times a day, or processes that I found myself redoing on almost every shot, and just had that thought of like, there has to be a better way, and that curiosity, that drive to figure it out. And the way that I normally approach these things is like, okay, who's learned Python in the past and how did they do it? I asked a bunch of my colleagues and they just kind of shrugged and said, I don't know, like I just figured it out. I read the documentation. And I would say I'm more technical than creative, but I'm not a programmer. I'm not a technical person. Definitely within the standards of some very, very intelligent people that work in visual effects. So I did sit down with the documentation. I tried those like Udemy courses on like Python 101, but nothing really stuck. And it goes back to what we were saying about, I had this to-do list myself of like, here's the 5 things that all my colleagues have said I need to do to master this. I did them and I came out the other side being like, oh, I can't really put this into action. So what did I do? I just dove in and I tried to figure it out rather than taking the course and hoping I could apply it. It was like, okay, what's the smallest problem that I have that I think I could find a way to automate or make easier, and just do it. And it's a very subtle mindset shift, but by doing that, you're naturally helping yourself build that curiosity because you have a need or a desire to solve this problem. And rather than this esoteric information, you're then figuring out, what's the small bit of Python I need to figure out this problem. Okay, great, I did that. You get that dopamine hit, you're kind of keen to keep going, and you just go bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And it naturally like led me to create my own Python for New course, because I feel like there's a lot of people who are similar to me and want to kind of get started, don't know the first steps. And I felt like it was what I needed when I first kind of stepped into things. But yeah, like I all that to say, I don't think anybody necessarily needs a course. I think they just need to do it and figure out what their problem is and try and help themselves. And naturally, you just start asking better questions that way.
What I see, the similarities, I always describe like something like Python is actually exactly like learning a language. If you learn English, French, German, it's exactly, Python is a language. It's just a little bit more technical, but I mean, everyone who learned German, it is basically programming on steroids. You basically need to have your vocabulary, you need to have your grammar, and that's important, you need to train your ears and your mouth and maybe your hand to write or type or whatever. And the same thing applies for Python. You can watch million hours of Python videos, doing 10 courses, thousands of whatever, different teachers. As long as you don't practice typing yourself, writing it down, solving it, it's absolutely meaningless. And it doesn't mean that your brain is not able to like understand things. You can maybe through thousands of hours or hundreds of hours, you maybe look at something and you can understand it. But like with your ears and your mouth, besides the physical element of, your mouth being able to shape the sounds of the language, it's also that the brain connects the thought with the sound. And the same applies for Python. And it's multiple levels. It's logical, like applying logic is different than understanding logic. And it's this typical problem a lot of people have is, oh, when I watched it, I got it. But when I have to do the assignment, I don't understand what I'm doing. It's the most common problem I see. And the reason for that is, of course, you didn't really got it. To some degree, maybe, but maybe not enough. And the second reason is you are not used to, practiced enough to actually, express it, which is two different things. And you can always, like I always say, it's like a stopwatch basically for everything. So if you watch like 20 hours of videos, you kind of learned on that scale. You are processing some information and you have now 20 hours on processing information. And if you see something similar, you can maybe understand it. But then your processing watch on terms of creating things and using and mixing this information to your own like situations is zero. Your expectations should be exactly like that. Your expectation for one, you're getting better in like processing the information and learning more, understanding and taking harder questions. But your way of expressing yourself and writing, in this case Python code, is zero. So your expectation should be zero, but the problem is, and that's coming back to the education porn, basically we trick ourselves that the hours and hours that we did and the masterclass that we built should automatically transfer to our personal translation and actions, but they don't. And this creates this kind of spiral of frustration, this kind of spiral of higher and higher expectation. And in the end, the worst case is like, oh, I'm just not built for that. Similar to you, I kind of came from that too. I'm also always a little bit more technical, but I came more from the artistic side first. And I just figured out for me like, hey, I want to teach that for artists. And that's also where I focused at the end of the day more. And it means also the way I approach teaching is more from part of teaching for me is confidence, is creating the confidence. It doesn't matter if you're an artist and never touched like scripting before. To some degree, everyone can do scripting. To some degree, everyone can do every skill more or less. No one stops you to become, best driver in the world or something, or do completely something else. There's a potential for us with the information age to do that. And I think with all this around us, it creates this problem of having the wrong strategy, having the wrong mindset, getting constantly excuses of, I'd rather watch a few tutorials than actually write something or model something or compose something, And this is the biggest problem and that's why I describe it as this porn element. I mean, YouTube will probably kick me over that. It is this kind of like the cheap and easy Snickers way. What is the easiest way? I buy a course and watch it. Then I sit down and actually do something that is maybe much, much smaller than I would like to, but it is my hours that I collect for that skill, because I already have thousands of hours of listening and watching. But I have like 5 hours of actually doing, basically.
Totally. And that's not to say I don't think tutorials are useless. I think they're an amazing resource. And I think we're really lucky that YouTube exists and there's so many smart people out there who are willing to share their thoughts and ideas. But kind of going into something and trying it first, when you hit a roadblock, you'll be able to be more specific about the problem that you're having, which then lets you be more specific about the question you have. So if you're starting out day one, search a tutorial, how do I use Blender? You're going to get 1,001 results and none of them are going to teach you what you need to know. But if you spend a few months playing with it and it's like, I just can't quite seem to figure out how to like get this shader to look right, then you can go and search a tutorial on how do I make a lava shader? How do I make a chrome shader? And you'll get very specific tutorials on that. And in that way, you've tried it yourself, you've hit the roadblocks, you've then gone to search for a solution. Somebody's helped you by giving you that solution, and then you can implement it. And that's going to naturally seed it in your brain way more than just, starting from scratch. Like, show me the 100-hour tutorial that's going to show me everything. And what's really interesting is now in my job, I'm like in the hiring seat rather than being in interviews, people interviewing me, I'm interviewing other people. And it's night and day. You can tell the people who have gone to film school or some kind of computer science or art school because either their parents told them that's what they had to do, they felt like that was the qualifications they needed to get the job, versus people who naturally have that desire. And I think there's some personalities where going to school is definitely the right thing to do. There's some kind of paths where learning yourself is the right thing to do. But naturally, you can tell the types of people who are like, I'm driven, like I'm dedicated, I'm open to learning new things, and I know how to do it, versus the people who have just sat there and consumed 10,000 hours of knowledge thinking, all right, that's going to be my 10,000 hours, and then I'm going to be an expert in this thing.
One of the things that I did actually, I was doing your Python for Nuke 101 course. Funny enough, because I was actually working on my Python for Nuke masterclass itself. Because one of the reasons that I wanted to look into your course was you are a compositor. You come from that. I'm not a compositor. I'm a technical director. So for me was I still approached it a little bit differently if I compare our two masterclasses. But I still wanted to have this connection to the compositing itself. You know, it shouldn't just be Python in Nuke, basically, but it should be Python in Nuke for compositors, you know, because to some degree, you know, I don't 100% know exactly what the most common workflow for every situation is and so on. So for me, it was also on that side. Welcome to our short mid-episode coffee break. If you love the content and would like to have a successful career in the film or games industry yourself, check out my website, 21artistshow.com. There you can find helpful articles, masterclasses, and coaching opportunities that help dozens of my students to bring their profession to the next level. That's all. Check out 21artistshow.com and share the podcast with cool people you know. Let's continue with the episode. I noticed that we definitely have a different approach to teaching and a different approach, basically a different philosophy behind our teaching. So I would be curious to hear, like, what is your philosophy when you, for example, create this course or when you do teaching in general?
Well, there's a couple of threads to untangle here. And the main thing is I just wanted to get people doing things. So how I structured the lessons was teach a concept, then set a challenge at the end of every lesson to force people to be like, okay, how do I apply this knowledge? And it's never a one-to-one translation of like, let's write a variable. Okay, now write a variable. It's here's how you write a variable. Now, how do you solve this problem? So it's very much going back to that problem solving mindset and thinking about how do I use the knowledge that I've just gained to solve this problem. And the kind of second thing is in terms of pre-recorded tutorials, it's funny to say, but I actually don't find them as effective as in-person teaching. And the reason is like you can do your best to convey all the ideas and the knowledge in a video, but it's a little bit of a disconnect between yourself and the person that you're teaching. And when I made that course, I just wanted to kind of teach as many people as I could because I knew there was a lot of compositors who really wanted to learn Python. And I knew I also didn't have enough time in the day to help everybody that I wanted to help. So I chose that route to make this very polished video tutorial for people who might want it and challenge them, provide them support whenever they got stuck and needed it through like a Slack channel. And that works pretty well. Like in terms of a course that you could buy and do in your own time, it worked pretty well. But the difference between that and now teaching people that I work with new things that they haven't encountered. So for example, we've got a couple of senior compositors who are interested in making the leap to the lead role. So I've been teaching them all these concepts about, like a good example recently is like, how does a color pipeline work? It's something that you always interact with as an artist, but you don't really need to know how it works until you reach those like lead supervisor positions. So having that one-on-one time is like certainly less polished, but you have instant feedback of like, this person's getting it. And the way that I'm conveying this information is really resonating with them, or subsequently, the way that I'm teaching or the way that I taught the last person and the way I'm teaching this person is totally different. They learn in a completely different way. And how can I tailor those lessons to fit the learning style of this person?
I can totally also relate to a lot of things that you said. I saw that definitely in your course. It was more on the practical side. You're like a compositor. you want to learn a few things to get you started. Basically, that was like, it was not about, let's talk about data types for half an hour or something like that. It was basically like, okay, first chapter, how do we create a node and how do we connect a node maybe? And then just like you have already something that you can basically come back tomorrow to work and say, oh yeah, I can do a very small thing. And if I'm creative enough, I can actually already integrate that, even if it's not like a huge thing. But what you say before is like, oh, I have this 5 nodes I always have to regenerate every time, which you can theoretically do after like 1 or 2 hours of watching such a lesson. So I think that is exactly the approach I saw when watching yours, and also saw very specifically that you're focused completely on compositors. It was like compared to me, I'm focused more on visual effects people, technical artists, technical director, people in that direction, while you were absolutely like, pinpointed on your compositor. I know what your needs are, so let's focus on that, and so bring you as fast as I can to deadline. And I think in later top part of the masterclass, you were trying to kind of roll back a little bit and give back like a little bit background, so it's not just quick and easy things, but also like, oh, in this moment, let's just untangle a little bit data types or functions for a moment, because we use them in the first few chapters, but we never really explain what they are, basically. And so it was a very interesting approach, a little bit, that I also liked in general. I think it's definitely, it's different to what I do, but also not, because I think there is an element of staying current, staying relevant, and not just having this, typical university thing or school thing where you learn quadratic equations and whatever, and you're like, I don't even know why. I don't see the point. I understand. And the other part, which you described exactly, which is also a problem in school and stuff, is this one-to-one translation thing, where you give someone the formula and the assignment is basically the same thing. That's pointless. There's nothing to gain if you say like, oh, I will teach you how to create a read node, a write node, and how I connect them. And your task is create a read node and a write node and connect them. It's like, yeah, every monkey with half a brain could do that, basically, and probably they can actually prove that. But I think that is the other part that I really think is great, that the mixture of teaching someone and then challenging to some degree that they need to, I always call it like Lego pieces. I give you a lot of small Lego pieces, and now I tell you like, build a chair, build a house, and bigger, but it's still always this like, oh, I can use a split or a replace here. So I have 2 tools to break down this, string to make it different. And then it's more or less what I try to do is like, yeah, you have the options. You have to understand that you have options. That's the first step. But then you have to understand which one is the best, because there is a specific option that will be the best for this specific situation, even though both could solve the problem. And I mean, that applies also in the creative world. You can solve the same problem through color grading, through this. But at the end of the day, there is a best way in a lot of situations. And I think having this mixture of tools and the mind to, understand how to use the tools besides one situation, I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, totally.
One other thing I was wondering about pre-recorded versus live. So I'm not 100% on your side in that, but I'm also 100% on your side. It's a weird contradiction. So I believe, yes, you need pre-recorded things. First one, for the sake of the teacher, I will get insane if I would have to explain every bit. Like if I were to explain data types, or I don't know how to create this or that every time, I think I would get insane. It's just boring. It's not very interesting to explain the same concept every week, month, whatever. I think that's just an insanity. But I absolutely believe there's a limitation of what you really can learn from a pre-recorded video. But I think where you can improve the pre-recorded video to have it this extra usability is that you use editing for that. The shortcoming of a pre-recorded video is if it's just a live cut.
Exactly.
Basically with a little bit of cutting, just make it not like boring or something. I think where you can improve the pre-record video if you use graphics, visualization, intercutting, things that where you can explain it more, where life you wouldn't be possible to do all these tricks and speed and whatever, you can slow down or speed up and stuff like that. I think there is pre-recording is much better than live. But as you said, live is the one that adds individualism, that adds the kind of like you can also adjust to someone's needs basically. And there is this element of life where you just pay more attention. You are, it's this kind of, so I think that you cannot replace both. So I think at the end of the day, if you want to learn a skill, and that's how I structure my masterclasses, is you need the pre-record information, because also you can rewatch them and they're well made and so on and well designed. But you need an opportunity to ask questions. You need the opportunity to get feedback. And combined with that, you need the opportunity to challenge yourself through tasks. And as you said, I think the best tasks are a few one-to-one translations, and then a few like, okay, look at this few strings. What is the pattern that you can use to break them apart or whatever? It's impossible to just like, always adjust that. You always have to look at the tools and see how can you, misuse them sometimes to get the results like that. And I think this layer of multiple elements, I think that for me personally, that's how I teach, is the best way to teach, is this mixture of predefined, clear and thoughtful information and live reaction and opportunity to, give the people, like some people struggle on that level, some people struggle on that level. And if you give them prepackaged everything, I think it ends up having this weird thing where you get so disappointed and you're like, oh, I don't get it, this part.
I guess it also comes down to like how people prefer to learn. Some people do just need that personal touch of like someone holding their hand. Some people are very self-motivated and can take a pre-recorded thing. But yeah, it really depends on the person, I'd say. And my advice for people wanting to learn a new thing is figure out what your learning style is. Are you self-motivated? Great, do a pre-recorded course, but don't do it because the marketing of it promises that you'll be the next big thing, or you do this or do that. You do have to really look into like, okay, is this just going to be somebody talking at a screen, not to me? Is it going to challenge me? Are there like challenges included in the lessons? But also, if you're somebody who does need that personal touch, that's totally fine. There are definitely like good options out there for quite a lot of things, even outside of visual effects, that you might want to learn. Where a perfect example is I really wanted to learn how to play tennis. I've played tennis casually my entire life, but I was garbage at it. My sports and my family don't mix. So I hired a coach because I could go on YouTube and I could watch videos. I know I've got the self-discipline to like go out and try things, but it was valuable to me in that instance to have somebody be like, okay, this is how your form should look. I'm watching you and you're doing it wrong. This is how you correct. So even within different contexts, like when I learn visual effects, I like just getting in there and doing it and asking questions and like looking up tutorials when I need them. But when I learn something like that, which I'm garbage at, I find a lot of value in that personal touch.
One of the YouTubers that I kind of admired, Matt Diavella, he has like the Ground Up show, and I really, really liked it. And it basically inspired the way I approach that the podcast has a video. I really enjoyed that. So that's one of the reasons that we had to talk like a pre-call where we talked about quality and recording and stuff like that, because I kind of enjoyed, the big part for me was watching the people, in decent quality and audio. And so I basically saw his work. And for example, one of the things I did, I enrolled in his YouTube class, for example. I was like $200 or something like that. And I knew from the beginning, in this case, it's a little bit a different situation, but comes with the same result, is like, I knew from the beginning it will not be a mind-blowing experience because I was on YouTube for years now. I know all the basic that he was teaching in. But one of the reasons was first like giving a little bit back kind of situation. I kind of liked his content and inspired me also, and so on. But also there was an element that actually made a change from me, and it was how much work he actually puts into each of this video. And to some degree, maybe I understood that, but not really, to be honest. And if seeing him like sitting down first, it was the first time, I don't know why, but I really was thinking about B-roll. It was just not, I knew it and I saw it, but I was never thinking of putting it into my work as much, intuitively here and there, but never like, oh, I'm talking, let's throw in some shots of whatever I'm talking about. And how much work he sits down, like, a whole day to record all the elements for like a 10-minute video. I was like, hey, now I understand why his videos are so good. And it was this basically one element out of this like 5-8 hours thing that really changed my perspective on this masterclass and also podcast. Is I'm not sitting there and shooting B-roll left, right, and center, but now I'm sitting in the editing a lot of times, like, hey, can I spice it up? Can I make it clearer and stuff like that? And just this investment, helped me push up the quality. And also, and that's the other thing, it opened a new world for me where I'm like, I'm now in the B-roll world, basically. I'm now in the graphics world, which I did a little bit before, but never to that quality. And, like where I was not sitting there. I was like, okay, I want a coffee machine. So I put my camera, maybe record and go away. Where like now it's more like, okay, put that. Should I move that around, put a few lights, do a re-recordings on my fingers, like where I literally do quality control and all this stuff. And it changed how the challenges that I suddenly find in the whole thing, where a few things are now automatic, like talking and all the basic technical stuff. And now I'm focusing on this other thing. And it comes back to this like seasoning of your challenges and thing. Even if you do the same thing again, and I mean, for 2 or 3 years, I'm doing this. But what happened is, in the beginning, I was needed to focus on what I say. I had to change. I did a lot of fill words and whatever. Now I don't think about the recording or what I say, and I'm mostly focused on you. I mostly focus on things that are around that, the topic and stuff like that. And later I'm mostly focused on like, how can I improve the quality through better, crisper results and better storytelling or more interesting things. And I think that is the big element that we all need to focus on, especially if we get to a specific level of the basics where we like, okay, how can I improve it? And what do I need to get there? So if I need to hire a coach to get there, if that is what it takes,
totally,
I invest that. If I need to buy a masterclass or travel somewhere into an event or whatever, I think this is this strategy thing that I mentioned in the beginning is like, that's the best way of modern kind of information age is if you understand what you need, you understand how you can go there, you can do it yourself, you can hire a coach, you can watch this masterclass. And as you mentioned perfectly, you have to understand who you are and your learning type and your kind of bullshit type a little bit, your fears, which is also a big problem, where you end up agonizing about the font and the title image or the thumbnail of the podcast in Spotify, where you spend like days and days on that kind of bullshit, instead of sitting down and recording 1 or 2 episodes more or something like that. And I think that is the big important thing, is to be looking at yourself a little bit, looking at your goals, and just be like, just cold-hearted, like, okay, that's who I am, that's how I learn, that's where I want to be. How do I get there?
Yeah, exactly.
Because the opportunities are there. You can get your course and jump directly into the topics. You can get my course, be more into the technical directing direction, but it's just a slower kind of approach where you build up basically kind of knowledge. So later you will get this kind of big payoff more, But at the end of the day, it's all about kind of like reflecting on yourself, reflecting on your goals, and just finding the line between. And of course, there will be, as you said, directions and points, milestones. But what stops us from, doing it strategically? Why are we bullshitting ourselves so much nowadays that we always end up like, buying Udemy courses or having this, constant pressure of ourselves? Is like, I would like to become a compositor, but every time I open Nuke, I would rather watch some Netflix or something like that,
Yeah, too bad there's no such job as professional Netflix watcher.
I'm pretty sure there is. So I'm 100% sure. I mean, what was it in Japan? You can find the weirdest ones. Professional walker or nothing doer, I think was his job. So basically, the only thing that he does, he doesn't do anything. He's basically there. and he just replies very simply, and his job is basically a company person, but he's not like really interacting. It's just presence.
How did you discover what your learning style was?
I think that's something kind of that develops a little bit. Same thing as you kind of go through the motions. And for me, I noticed like I'm someone motivational driven, which to some degree everyone is. But I'm really someone who needs to find really the passion for something, and then I'm really diving into. If I'm really interested in something like making a podcast or creating a course or becoming a technical director, if I really get into this vibe of really wanting to do it, I just jump into it and I'm full blown for multiple months into that and watch as much as I can, read, try things and so on. And it took a while to get to that level. But I think what the biggest difference made for me was actually on an exception level here. It was actually a university that made the change. It was the Film Academy, which is still a private university, but the Film Academy actually showed me how to learn. And that's something that I would summarize. The biggest part of this experience was, of course, I learned how to become a technical director and did a lot of things in there and did on projects. But the most important thing that I learned was a mixture of confidence. It's like, oh, I can learn anything. If I want to become a cinematographer or if I want to become a tennis player, whatever, I can do it. And the other part, and is back to this strategy thing, is being realistic about how to get there. How do I connect the point of now to the point of where I want to go with a mixture of, you have to define where that is exactly. Cannot be working at Pixar. No. It has to be really, I want to work at Pixar at this position doing exactly that. And if you have that, then the question is, what do I have to do and how long do I need to get there? And then you can decide, because if you know what you have to do and you know how long it will take, then it is something that you can decide, oh, do I want to do that? Is that something that I really, really want to spend the next 3 years of learning this, that, and the other one? And then you will not, if you want to do that or not. I can promise you that. If you have this clear thing in front of you, where you have still to put in the details, you don't know everything, but you kind of can guess, for example, let's say I want to become someone who works professionally on fur. I think I could be professionally good in fur half a year, 1 year, depending on the complexity and what I do exactly. Just because from the information that I know I can get access to what I already know, to where I'm probably need to be to get that hired as professional. And that's it. And that makes for me easy to learn, because it means every time I'm learning, I always kind of analyzing what I have to do to get there. And the biggest question is, do I really want to do that? Because at the end of the day, what you have to do when you do something like that is, and that is probably maybe the most important realization, is you have to say no to a lot of other things. So you, for example, couldn't approach your tennis career. And that's why you need to hire a coach in this situation and pay money for that. So basically, you were working as a visual effects artist to pay your tennis coach. That was the result of the whole situation, which you could have gone this career from the beginning, man, So, but I think that is this investment cost that I think people don't understand is, do I really want to do that if I look at it like in front of me in terms of like a map? If I put the map in front of me of how this career looks like, where I'm going there, and kind of what it entails, do I spend my time, effort, where I'm don't go partying, or I don't do this other thing or something like that? And I think if you can answer that one with a yes, then learning comes naturally, kind of. And again, one of the things, I don't say you have to do it then. What I say is just check in if it's still the thing that you want to do. And then you can always say, like, after 3 months doing a podcast, doing new compositing, you're like, this is horrible. Or this is even like you notice like where you start to work on things, and it kind of does its own thing, and then you notice like, hey, this is actually, I forget my time, and I'm just starting to Google things every 5 seconds because what is this? So I think that is basically how I noticed, how I kind of learn, is this mixture of strategy, clear goal, clear path to this goal, and understanding, of course, myself a little bit of I'm a visual learner. I'm an acoustic and visual learner. So I need to see something, but I also need to hear it. So I cannot just read articles, and I also cannot just watch videos. It will not I need kind of both. I need to have some resources like PDFs and stuff, and I also need to watch videos where, like, a fast version and a slow version, basically. I need this kind of two. And that helps me, for example, in terms of being picky. I also like things that are more closer to what I do. So I think maybe you kind of hinted at it a little bit. One of the things I absolutely hate about most Python courses is when they open up the terminal. It's such a devastating, it's unrelatable to the nth degree. This is the reason why they feel like they cannot connect to things, is because it's gatekept through bad presentation and non-realistic situations. No one in the world does Python in the command line. I literally did it a few times in my life when I needed to, because it was part of a command line thing. But in visual effects, in programming, in software development, whatever, no one uses the command line as their default, scripting editor. With exception of Vim, which even that is it's a topic for itself, basically. So what about you? Like, what was the thing that made you kind of click with your learning style?
It's something that I've found has evolved over time too, which is equally interesting and frustrating. But for me, it was more a brute force method of like, I want to learn this thing, let's try it. And if it didn't stick, I would try another way. One thing I still have trouble with today is soaking up information through reading alone. So I would buy a physical copy of the book and the audio book and read at the same time as I would listen. And it sounds silly, but it's effective for me. And naturally, like my desire to learn has always been driven by curiosity. Whenever there's been something I'm curious about, I dive headfirst in and it consumes me. But there's also the other side of it where there's things that you might want to learn or might need to learn that curiosity isn't there from the get-go. And it's those times that I've found particularly tricky. And I do the same as you in terms of like trying to think of what this goal is and extrapolate, okay, like what steps might I need to like go or might I need to do to get there? And if I do that and I'm excited, that's a good signal to me of like, even if this isn't the best plan, like let's kind of continue down the path. But if I do that and get to the end and have that sense of like, okay, I've completed this task, now what? Then that's a good signal to me that it's like, well, it was always worth the time to kind of think about, but it's not worth the time. There's this author that I really admire called Derek Sivers, and he has a few books on a bunch of different topics, but one of them is titled Hell Yeah or No. And there's an article of the same name on his website. And it's really about like, think about what makes you excited and go and do it. Even if there's a little bit of interest, maybe it's not the right thing because as you already mentioned, you do have to sacrifice something to gain inevitably what you want.
I mean, at the end of the day, you have to sacrifice most things, because when you spend like 24 hours on something, every other thing that you could have spent it on, you could become a tennis teacher, a programmer, whatever, everything you could have done, you didn't.
Totally.
Basically, you decide for one thing. And sometimes there's this paralysis of like, oh, but I'm so interested in a lot of things. But if you have this mentality, then you end up doing nothing at the end of the day. And I think one of the things, and we mentioned that, and I think that is my biggest way of learning is I must, without a doubt, always have a practical reason to learn something. And that makes me a very bad researcher, I notice, actually. And also in creativity. My creativity comes from copying. Great artists steal and good artists copy or something like that. That is actually how I noticed is my best learning style, actually, and my most motivation. So, and I can explain it very simply. So first thing, I need a practical reason. I will never ever, and I don't believe anyone in the world will ever sit down and say, you know what? I really want to learn scripting. That sounds like a fantastic idea. Or, you know what? I really want to learn camera, about f-stops and whatever. Basically, with a few exceptions, probably no one ever said that in the world. No one started like that. No one was that. You can be motivated and then you think that's what you need to do. You're motivated of becoming a cinematographer, so you're like sitting down. But the connection is, there's a disconnect there instantly, because you force yourself to do something that you're maybe not interested in, because also very technical, just to get to somewhere where you didn't even start to approach it. So for me, always everything is practical. So for example, Python would be something where I sit down as an artist, I'm doing something, and then as I'm lazy, I don't want to do this thing 10 times a day. I'm like, okay, what is the easiest way to get out of this hell? I learn a few lines of Python code or Mel code, or actually my first thing was MaxScript code. And then I put them together. And then what happens is exactly what is like, oh, that was fun. Like, I really saw the result, and I enjoyed this logical puzzle of scripting or modeling or whatever. And then it kind of spirals into the next challenge and the next challenge. But it starts with a practical purpose. It doesn't start with, I want to learn Python because I want to have a better career. I want to become a technical director. That can be, again, this big thing, but it cannot motivate you to really sit down, and it will not motivate you. You need this. Okay, I want to become this. What are the things that I currently need to get better? And then focus on that. And the funny thing is, we overestimate what we actually need to do to become something. And I can just come back to this podcast, for example. Just because I want to make a podcast doesn't mean I have to become good with video cameras or audio or whatever. I can use the shittiest thing and focus on making a good podcast, or focus on presenting it well, or whatever I'm interested in. And then again, back to the seasonings, and then I can maybe win an interest because I use this camera every episode and have this battle with this resolution or whatever. So I sit down and Google how to record with a higher quality and more sharpness. Suddenly I became interested in camera things and so on. So it spirals from this practical thing to something that is actually interesting, where you also have the steps before, by accident. I was using camera as a medium to get my podcast done, and I didn't pay attention to it because I was not interested. But through this work with it, I learned more about it, and I felt more comfortable to explore better qualities. And it was also a little bit of a want to, because I wanted Matt Diavella, I wanted to copy his quality, his color grading, his, sharpness. And I was like, I cannot get it. And the only way I can get it better is through better understanding of lighting, real life lighting, and recording. And that is basically how I see learning for me, is always looking at things my goal is, and something that I actually need at the moment. I see myself failing at things which shouldn't be super hard for me, but because I don't have any practical reason to learn them. It's just a hypothetical, it would be cool to work with Houdini in the future thing, which doesn't work for me. And I have the feeling it doesn't work with most people, actually, to be honest.
You've kind of talked about Matt Diavella being an inspiration, and you've taken a course that he's made to learn how he does what he does. But are there any lessons that you've learned from other people who inspire you, and how have you put those into practice or incorporated that into your workflow?
I'm trying to think of flipping it back, because at the end of the day, you know that you are the guest of this episode. Yep. I tell you, man, you are a better moderator, no question about that. You have a natural way of flipping back the question. It's incredible. It's You would make definitely a great host for events or podcasts or whatever. I think that's
Thank you for saying that.
Your natural talent, actually.
What are some of the lessons you've learned from people who inspire you, and how have you put it into practice in your own work?
I think there was something interesting where I kind of was learning something from you at this moment when you started, because the way that you approach a lot of your learning and growth is very much people-based. And that's something that is not always specifically for me the most important thing. Where when I was listening to you, it was always this kind of, you look at someone as the ideal person to learn from, to become that skill and so on. And that's rarely something I actually did. What I mostly did was using their results to kind of create something that I like. So it was more in the same direction, but I was more focused on their work than on the person that is behind that. So for me, for example, when I watched the podcast of Matt Diavella, for example, I liked the visual, I liked the way that they talk, but I was never trying to even close copy his style. Besides maybe the like obvious, I want to have this quality, his color grading, whatever, and his flow, very kind of meta things I wanted. But what I never wanted was I didn't want to ask similar questions or do the same kind of way, because I know I wanted to infuse it with my own style and my own topics and whatever, So I even didn't want to approach the same topics, the same way of how he's talking. So I was not even copying his way of moderation, for example. And so that's how I see a lot of things. And for me, again, I think this kind of stealing from other people and using that as a base form for your own work, I think for me personally is one of the best ways to learn fast, successful, and focusing on things that you care about on the first part. For example, stealing his, framing and whatever I could, some things I couldn't steal his quality, like in terms of image. It was impossible. I just couldn't. But I could steal his framing. I could steal his introduction beats and stuff like that, and then focusing on things that I was more interested in by, having an interesting conversation, I could embrace that and don't think too much about what's the font, what's the music. Yeah, something like his music, something jazzy, boom, done. How long is the introduction? Something like he does. 20 seconds, done. And then through time, I'm basically trying to embrace that things that I learn and want to become better on. And still at the end, I'm starting to think about the quality of the video to get to the style. So I still used his big frame as something, but I filled small things of it first that I was interested in and just, copied as much as I can that I couldn't. Easy peasy, I'm not a podcaster. How do I know how long the intro should be? And I'm not an editor, so how do I know how many intercuts I should do there? So why not like do something like he or other people do? So what I do often is I use one frame as my big frame, like his podcast, and then I get inspired and by other people and watch theirs. So I maybe got inspired for the introduction from another podcast, or I got a cool introduction from a different one or font from one another, but his was the main thing. And I think that is the approach I do. It's still the philosophy behind that I try to understand. It's not just the superficial thing, but I always keep it on my style. I never interested to copy someone or become someone, more or less. And I'm not looking at the person that much, to be honest. So it looks like you're doing, to some degree, there's an overlap, but you're doing actually the opposite to some degree.
To some degree, yeah. I mean, I won't lie. I think earlier in my career, I was definitely playing the game of like chasing the titles in terms of like I wanted to gain seniority. I wanted to like work for all these companies. But I think it got to a point where I gained some seniority and some experience where I kind of sat myself down and had that chat and asked like why. And it was at that point where I started to like discover all these fundamental ways of like how I work and how I learn. So I think in some ways I do similar things where I'm inspired by a person because they're able to produce a specific result that I personally find appealing, whether that's in visual effects or something completely different. And I think it's almost impossible to replicate somebody. Not that you should strive to replicate somebody or be somebody else because you haven't lived their full experience, but I use like people's results as a source of inspiration where to start, but then I also look at the person and what makes them tick and maybe what has happened to them in the past that means that they're able to do what they do now. How have they learned? What have they gone through? And a great example of somebody who like embodies this for me is Chris Do, this amazing designer. And his goal at the moment is like trying to teach 1 billion people how to like run a sustainable business based off what they like to do. And I'm not trying to build my own business, but I love this guy's mindset and like the way that he can really clearly elaborate his thoughts and his path and like how he's able to get from point A to point B And even if that's irrelevant, how does that translate to you? And what are the fundamental, like, core concepts of a specific topic? And that's something that is kind of stuck with me. And I feel like that's what I try and embody when I try and teach somebody something, or when I'm trying to learn something new for myself, is like, what are the first principles? How do we break this apart? Who has followed these steps before, or similar steps? What can I learn from them? And how can I take this method in like a modular way to put these pieces together and do this for myself?
I can totally relate to that. Actually, a big fan of "You're not Chris Don't, you're Chris Do." I actually used one of his best videos, one of his whiteboard sessions. Actually, it actually helped my business, and it's about discount. And it really helped me to figure out when to discount or not to discount. And we are so used to do discounts, like, so if you would sell a course, you're like, okay, Black Friday, Christmas, new course, whatever, you just throw in discounts left, right, and center, because that's how you're conditioned to do on Steam and everywhere. But actually, you should always have a clear background behind discount, because else people expect it. And to some degree, a discount can devalue your product, because you know that from Udemy. I mean, I don't think anyone buys a Udemy course that is not discounted, because it's so like common that they're 95%, 90% discounted. I bought one time a Steam game which was discounted the next day 30, 40%. I felt the pain. It was so weird, but since then it's like, yeah, so for me, that's something I learned, and yeah, absolutely agree with that. But again, I'm less looking at Chris Do as a person, but looking at what he's building. The 1 billion thing, to some degree, I have that too. I have this thing where I strongly believe that technical directing is one of the best jobs in the industry, because it has this flexibility where you can become more artistic if you want to, or more technical if you want to. And you are still in this middle ground of not really a researcher or programmer, but also not really an artist, but also, yes, both of the same time, depending on company position and work. And I believe that scripting or Python is one of the core principles that everyone should learn in our industry, because we're so technical, and it will help most people. You don't have to become a Python developer. Just making a few lines is already, if you can automate through a few lines, every department will benefit from that. Because the argument is like, yeah, you have programmers, they don't have time for that. You have pipeline developers who never have time or never do the small tool that you need, where always happy when a colleague of yours is like, oh, I did this few lines where you click on it and it changes the paths or something like that. So I totally get it. But even again, coming back to Chris Do, it's like, it inspired me the way that he approached that, and how he gives content for free, and how it has this vision and stuff. And I think I use that a little bit as inspiration, but again, staying more on the way that he does it and less on the person. For a very sympathetic, of course, charismatic person, but I'm always looking more at what can I take away for my courses or my presentation, or even my business. Like, for example, he gives a lot of content for free, and that was actually a thing in the beginning where I did, and then when it became a business, I'm like, should I? How much is free and how much is not free, and how do I decide? And that's something, for example, that he was definitely one of the people that inspired me. Of like, yeah, but basically, you can give everything for free, more or less. You should have somewhere where people can go to pay you, but it doesn't take away giving something for free that people end up paying you. It's a weird concept, but it actually works. And the funny thing, I saw that was with Matt Diavella, which took years at the end of the day, because I was watching his content for years, and I did this podcast inspired by him and so on. But what ended up, I bought his course, even though there was not like a lot of sense in doing that. It was not a course that I really, really needed, or I was expecting to have much value. It was like, maybe I find something interesting. I'm currently building on YouTube a little bit more. Maybe there's something in there that can help me to, ship my way through that. But I will not expect like, mind blown kind of thing. It was more of like paying back to all the content and all the inspiration that the person gave. And that's where, for example, again, like people like Chris Do inspired me with their work, actually. So I really find it's very interesting how you approach that, because it's it was always a little bit different for me. But to be honest, in the last few years, I see it more and more of seeing inspiration and copying other people and our work instead of just always wanted to create everything from scratch, everything from zero, because it's so wasteful and slow and unmotivating to do everything from zero. But also to have a person as a kind of a standard, kind of like, oh, I want to mimic his way of working. I think that's a great idea. If you have a great lead to say, I really like how he communicates his ideas, or I really like how he gives feedback, how he takes gives criticism or whatever. I think that is such an inspiring thing in general. So I think that is something that I kind of recently picked up more and more, where I'm starting to pick not just techniques and elements, where I'm more about the whole package, the person a little bit, not just specifically trying to copy them, but more about, I like their style, so I keep that in the back of my mind as something that, oh, next time maybe I could go a little bit more in Ben's way of moderating, for example. It's a great idea to, because then you have someone like, how would Ben do that, basically?
Yeah, it's like an interesting barometer. And I think it's always been helpful for me to start that way, like in terms of trying to unpack how a person like ticks and what decisions they would make in a certain thing. But inevitably, you kind of have to break away from that. So when I'm thinking about first principles and approaching something for the first time, that's how I start. But then naturally, I'll start to like veer in my own direction or the direction that interests me. But it's always nice to have that as a foundation of like, I'm stuck on this problem. I can't figure it out. Is there a video or a podcast or a book or something that can like help me solve this problem, and like put yourself in a different frame of mind? And I always find it fascinating because depending on who you talk to, you'll get a completely different answer.
Kind of like engross yourself completely into that. So one of the things that I do, for example, is I was like looking into growing as a person. So I started to read books and stuff, and then I stumbled upon a podcast, how to be a better person or something like that. So listen to that. So I basically I divided my interest into multiple fields. I was not just watching YouTube videos, but I was reading books, I was listening to a podcast, I was looking out, I was like at work or in a cafe, and then I was like, oh, this barista, he was really good, like how he handled the situation. Something I try to kind of remember or be inspired by that. And I think that is how I also approach learning, is not just, and I think it comes back to the beginning, not just this one element or this one, masterclass, and that's the way to learn it, but more about like as many information focused on the goal. It doesn't really matter. And you need this repetition. And that's something that how I learned actually programming is I was reading 5 books and the first 4 books didn't help me. But when I was reading the 5th book, a few elements from all the other books kind of come back to some degree and filled up the holes. And that's how I do it now too, is like, oh, I watch a YouTube video, I do maybe a masterclass, I maybe talk to a colleague, I watch someone else doing something or whatever. And then just kind of from all these sources, I slowly put the pieces together to a clear goal, where I know where I'm going. At the same time, but I also try to focus on one thing as my main principle, my main course or my main something. But I add all these elements to fill that, because just to be sure that if the masterclass doesn't give me all the elements, or this live event doesn't cover all the topics, I definitely have heard about this topic before, or like already listened to 5 hours of this topic before I start to, it's all this kind of small things that end up. And every time I'm getting interested into, I really just dive in and just grab everything I can find, basically, and focus on the result at the end. It's like, okay, how much does it help me to get to this level? It doesn't go away. What does, I'm kind of like always, and I'm always looking at it, if I still don't have the same color grading as I won before, I'm like, okay, this masterclass was not good enough. What YouTube video, book can tell me how I can grade my stuff better so I get to this result? Because it doesn't matter what will help me, it just has to. And I just take and throw away until I figure it out, either through accumulation of things or maybe finding this one that really sparks you, and then you're like, oh, this tells me all the workflows that I actually use to get to the results, you know?
Yeah, totally. And I think that's really important to highlight too. I'm certainly in the camp of like I feel like I'm very self-motivated and can learn whatever I want to learn as long as I put my mind to it. But that was almost a defeatist attitude because I'd jump into something, obviously fail because it's something I'd never done before, and I could learn from that. But it took me a long time to come to grips with it's okay to fail and learn from it. But what's even better is learning from other people's mistakes too. So if you're learning from somebody who's already been doing this thing for 20 years, you can very quickly dissect what works for them, what hasn't worked for them, whether it's through, yeah, a book, a podcast, a movie, or something or other. And then pick the pieces you like, the pieces you dislike, what speaks to you, what doesn't speak to you, and use that to form the way that you do anything or learn anything.
One of the things I always recommend for, I think everything, but I definitely on the side of scripting and Python is code review. For example, even on basically the first week, your first script, if you have the chance that someone can give you like a checkup of like, hey, you can do it a different way, or that's also like a point is you did it well. The learning experience is there. Okay, I should continue, double down on this way. Or someone tells you, yeah, the naming is not good. There are 5 different better ways to do it. And then like, oh, okay, so in the future, I will not rehash the same bad kind of way of doing it. You know, I always say it's like having a bad handwriting in the beginning. It's super hard to get away if you're like doing that for 10 years. It's the same thing, you know, if you have a unorganized nuke scene, it's super hard to, you know, get into the flow of always putting things and, you know, backdrops and whatever. So I think that is super important, is to kind of always be on this side a little bit. Kind of, what is the things that kind of stick out for you when we talk about something like education, or maybe being able to learn things that you say like, oh, I think this person will be flexible or will be getting the job done. It doesn't really matter if he's already on the master level now.
Yeah, great question. And of course, it's an incredibly complex one to answer because everybody's different and has their own unique characteristics to bring to the table and add to the team. But the main thing is curiosity. Like, I don't look at a CV or talk to somebody in an interview who's been doing something for 20 years or who has got a computer science degree and then went to film school and then went to art school before coming to us. I speak to them as a person. Like, why do you want to do this? Like, why is this the best opportunity for you? What do you have to gain? What do we have to gain? And it's almost a negotiation. And the characteristic that always jumps out is people who are just innately curious and interested people. Because I think in everybody's job, not just in visual effects, not every day is like a daydream and super good. There's going to be fun times, not so fun times. There's going to be times where you feel like a rock star and can do anything. There's going to be times where you're stuck with a shot that's just so challenging. And at the end of the day, I'm interviewing a person for how they're going to thrive under pressure on those bad days. And if you have somebody who's gone to the film school, got a computer science degree, they know how to answer the questions on the test because it's what they learned the last week, sure, that's okay. But if you're talking to somebody who's like, I've had this problem in the past, like I couldn't get through it, I can elaborate like the 5 steps I went through to get to the end of it and like talk through my process. Like you can very quickly start to unpack like, okay, this person can figure out their issues. And it's not about do they have to ask for help or not. It's just about that natural desire to like want to do better.
It's funny, I always say basically the better you are, and the higher you are in the kind of experience ladder, the more the interviews become basically like random conversations kind of thing. I know, like where I remember in the beginning, it was all about fixated on what did you do? What is this project? What's your background? Blah blah blah. And nowadays it's more about, hey, did you saw the movie? And or I saw this project that you were. And then you talk completely about anything else that sometimes have nothing to do with the position, with anything. Basically, you know, you sometimes talk about the best bar in London or something like that. But what I always feel is it's about like, you know, that means basically they already know that you can do the job. It's not about that. It's about how are you as a person, is it interesting to talk to you? Because again, you can feel like, okay, this person is easy and quick on his feet and whatever. And it's much more telling about that part, because the rest is already clear. He worked on Avatar, he worked on Star Wars. What else do you want from that person? Should be able to, in most cases, to do that. But the question that you cannot see there is like, is that person someone I can ask a question that he's maybe not familiar with? Or is he able to explain things? That's actually a big problem, where one of the biggest tips I have to give a lot of times is be able to explain your project. If you ask me about my open source pipeline Plex or my masterclasses, I can talk your ear off, just because I'm totally passionate about the background of it and why I did things, how I did things, and I think that is such if you go on that level, you don't even notice how things are progressing. You just are instantly in like, oh, he is passionate about this. He knows his stuff, because I can see that before, but he can also explain the background of things or how he can arrive things just by casually talking about something. And I think that is super, super helpful. No, thank you very much, Ben. It was such a pleasure to have you. Any plans for the future in terms of courses or something in that matter?
Nothing to announce yet. I have a mailing list from when I used to run Ben's Comp newsletter that I still send periodic emails out to people who follow that. But usually that's the first point of contact when I'm working on something new or looking for ideas for how I can help people.
Okay.
So yeah, if you're interested, go to my website and you can see everything that I'm up to.
That's it with this week's episode of the 21 Artist Show. Thank you so much for watching and listening. This podcast is 100% ad-free, and to keep it that way, check out my website 21artistshow.com. There you can find exclusive access to awesome masterclasses and coaching opportunities to work successfully in visual effects, animation, and games. Just go to 21artistshow.com. And don't forget to share it with people who would benefit from that content and tell them they're awesome. See you on the next episode. Next on the 21 Artist Show.
For an introvert, being honest and communicating can still be an effort, obviously. So that's where that practice side of things comes in. It's just if you oversell, that can be a problem. People can really feel like, I'm not sure, I think I'm being sold something here, and maybe what I'm actually getting is not what I'm being told I'm getting. You just have to be a little careful about overselling. Be honest, be communicative. Often people can get quite nervous in an interview situation, and nerves do all sorts of funny things to people. Some people, it makes them quite verbose. They can't shut up. They just talk and talk and talk. Now, obviously that can be a bad thing. You are getting information across, but often it can be too much information. Other people can have the opposite effect, particularly if you are an introvert. Some people can just clam up and almost appear rude or sullen. They're just things to be aware of about how you're presenting yourself. It's a balance. I think overdo it either way, and that becomes a problem.